Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 82. Our topic is Achieving Standard DID Methods, and our guest today is Daniel Buchner. Welcome, Daniel.
Hey there, how you doing?
Great. And so the audience might notice this change of decor. I'm not in my messy office today. I'm actually traveling in Europe. And I have a different hat today too. This is my open source conference hat, not my normal Identity hat. So things are a little changed, but we're pushing on. And yeah, before we dive into it, Daniel, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, started my early career, really the formative part of it at Mozilla, where I worked on, I was PM over our developer ecosystem at Mozilla, worked on developer tooling, APIs, did some web standard stuff around the browser engine and, various parts of it. So that's where I first kind of got introduced into standards and W3C and, all the bodies that form these standards. From there, I sort of halfway through, I found Bitcoin around 2011, and I, was enamored with the idea that, these types of things could be decentralized, and
I hope you
started
bought
playing
some.
around. Say again?
I hope you bought some.
I did, but not very much, to be quite honest with you. I mean, as a libertarian person trained in economics who is an engineer, it's kind of sad that I didn't buy more, but I always kind of had this lingering thought that what if, right? I was always like, well, it seems like it could work, but what if? And it was always usually around government and seizure, and so I never like threw a bunch of my money, which I didn't have much of at the time. But beyond that, like I looked at Bitcoin as at least an extremely interesting science project and started tinkering with it for the purpose of identity. And back then it was sort of just this 20% time thing. I would mess with the Mozilla. Me and a few other people were passionate about it there and had brought it up as a way that we could accept donations at Mozilla. And then when we started working on Firefox OS, they started developing installable web apps. And this is the precursor to like PWAs, the web apps that we see today. And it was a very centralized model. You would like check in your code and things would be referenced by Mozilla servers. And, we would do some safety and security checks. And, we maintained it like an app store because it was hard to do anything decentralized. And what I had sort of come to the conclusion of is that the user couldn't really own and control their data unless they own and controlled their identity. Because it was always like, well, log into the app store to get an app with your ID, which would be a Mozilla ID or some other centralized company. And then it was, well, where's the data for the apps go, right? The thing that actually wanted to do with identity at first was to create personal data stores based on user-owned identity. And the identity piece was kind of almost the least interesting. It was almost like to get to a personal data store that is centric to the user that obeys them, you kind of have to have identity they own. If the basis of the identity of the data store is controlled by some centralized entity, they would effectively control the data.
You could
So
be
it was like
default.
I really wanted the end thing, and to do the start, we had to solve identity, which I was like, oh, well, how hard could that be? And that was pretty naive thinking. Never had been to IAW before. Never really had paid too much attention to identity, other than I kind of knew how OAuth worked. I used all these things. And so that was my interest. And for like 3 years at Mozilla, I tried to sort of say, hey, like, why are we developing an app model for the web and not solving one of these like cardinal sins that we started the platform with, which was not having identity users own, and now we're just giving it away to large companies. So towards the end, in 2014, I sort of thought, hey, I'd really love to go solve this problem. Where would a good place be to do it? Because I knew it was a problem bigger than I could solve, or if I, go start a startup, I don't think startups are solving it. It's a really big problem. It involves a bunch of parties, tons of systems that exist, right? So you can't just will it into being no matter how much I would like to. So I had looked around specifically for opportunities at players in the identity industry, digital identity industry. And I had a friend who had gone from Mozilla to work on the Edge team at Microsoft. And I looked at that as, yeah, I mean, I guess I could keep doing browser stuff, but I really wanted an in to go to a company that was like a major player. And turned out, if people didn't know that, Microsoft is, right. Obviously, IAW people understand that, but like most people out there, like devs, don't actually know that. They don't know that like Microsoft is a massive player in this identity industry. They just think of consumer facing authentication, which is like Google and Facebook, as being like those are major ones, right? But not knowing Microsoft kind of runs the show in the enterprise. So I started there for Edge, and my plan was I'm going to give it as much time as I like the job, continuing to work on a browser, but specifically attempt to get into the identity division at Microsoft, because that's not where I was housed working on the browser. And so it took me about 9 months to a year. I probably did the browser job for a year, was like similar PM group role over there, and had sold into the corporate vice president that was in charge of the identity division at the time, the concept that user-owned identity and like credentials and all these things that even their products currently lacked were going to be a thing. I don't know exactly when, but it's going to happen, right? There's lots of tea leaves you can read. And it's going to be a thing. There's going to be a digitization of credentials that are today paper, just like we saw with email, right? Like paper mail was not long for this world as the major communication method. It digitized. We'd be crazy to think that the elements of proof between businesses, between people and governments isn't going to digitize. So they believed it, and they said, okay, well, why don't you transfer out of the browser area and work for us? We'll give you a team of 0, and you can formulate a hypothesis and kind of sell in what this product would be. And so it took about another 9 months to isolate, like, well, what is a strategy we could use? Ended up being like Authenticator is that. So I spent time there developing what would later be Entra Verified ID with the help of great people like Ankur Patel and other folks in there, Brandon, who runs the engineering org for Identity Division, and they were able to launch it. I left almost 5 years I spent doing that. I left right before they kind of launched to go to Block and work on finally the data store pieces for decentralized apps. And now I'm working at Gemini on a cryptocurrency focused wallet. Doesn't have a lot of identity touch points now, but it could. If we could potentially standardize a DID method or two, there'd be a lot more impetus to add it. So I guess that's a good, that dovetails into our actual topic.
Right, right. So I could pivot into the topic, which is achieving standard DID methods. But before we do that, I think most of this audience has probably heard of DID methods, but maybe you could just give a quick, like a 90-second overview of what are DIDs and what is a DID method?
Yeah, so DIDs, you should just think it's this odd word, decentralized identifier. Sounds a little bit, complex, formal, lots of syllables. But in reality, right, it kind of starts with that N-word identifier. And I think understanding that there's these 3 words that kind of sound the same but are very different. There's identifier, there is identity, right, and there's identification. And so identity is like you. It's like who you are, right? So that might not be one identifier. It could be many identifiers. Some people log in with a gamer ID to play like Xbox, and they might use a different one for social, and then they might log into something else for work, right? These are all identifiers. They represent your part of your identity that you're interfacing with. And then there's identification, which is proving some attribute about yourself or some knowledge you possess in relation to an identifier. So the identifier piece is what DIDs are about. And identifiers are simple to think about if you just look around the world today, right? Like your email address is an identifier. Your handle on Twitter is an identifier, right? It's just a string that's unique within a certain context, whether it's global or to an app, that people can see and identify information. You might say something on Twitter. They say CSU Wildcats said, right? And that's an identifier. Now, decentralized identifiers, the distinction there is obviously the first word, decentralization, which means instead of identifiers of today, which are largely centralized, your email address is owned by a company. If the company goes away or decides they don't like you, your email, that could be gone, right? You may not even be able to log in with some of the authentication methods. Certainly your handle is in apps, right? If Twitter bans people still and suspends people, you can have that identifier taken from you. It's
Right.
not under your control. And that's the
I
status
mentioned
quo
that
today.
before. The
So
fear
decentralized
of being
identifiers set out
deplatformed.
to create, go ahead.
Oh, I said this interjected before for a second. The fear of being deplatformed is really, really terrible because people put all these work into these platforms, and then you could be arbitrarily deplatformed and really have very little recourse there. Did you hear me okay?
Yeah, you broke up there a little bit, but what I
Oh,
did
I'll try
hear
and get
was,
closer.
fear
I'm
of
trying. It's weird
deplatforming,
because as I mentioned, my
and
hacky setup,
having
the
these things
microphone's not
taken.
working. Yeah, so the fear is people are really
Yeah.
afraid of being deplatformed. So they put a lot of work into the platform, and then if the provider cancels them, there's very little they can do about it. They have almost no recourse.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, today the identifiers that you use today, deplatforming is probably the biggest fear. And it started out trivially. Like 10 years ago, uh, it was not a huge issue. Like it just people didn't think about it, but it is so common today, and we see it not just from companies, but we see it from governments, right? Like if you do something in certain governments, like the CCP that controls China, like your identifier is very, very tenuous. Like it can be taken from you. You can have no proofs of things. Same thing with credentials, not being able to prove who you are. Those things being wiped have incredibly detrimental effects. So I think that decentralized identity is a human rights issue. To be quite honest with you, it is not even. It's not trivial. It's not just about losing like your followers on a cool app. For certain people, it could mean real material harms to them as a person. So I think it should be treated as a human right. And decentralized identifiers are in restoration of that level of control, giving you an identifier back that doesn't have a single point of loss that you control, that is independent of a third party, be it a company or a government. And I think that's the goal, right? Is to really empower users. If you can't empower them with their identity going forward, I think people are going to lose more and more and more control, especially with things like AI being on the horizon, where if you can't prove who you are or what you're controlling in that sphere, the chance that you'll be defrauded or that someone will masquerade as you or that you'll fall victim to any number of issues is just, I think, going to grow exponentially as AI gets better and better.
Okay, so let's pivot back to well, maybe I'll take a stab at this. So DIDs, what I think of DIDs as basically a way to have an identifier, but also to convey the context of that identifier. So we say, here's the type of identifier it is, and then here's the identifier itself. Um, and I think of did methods as a way to use that context to find out, okay, so I have this mechanism, and this is how I resolve that somehow to understand what that identifier means and how to use it. Did I get it
Yeah,
roughly right?
yeah. I mean, there's two parts of the identifier thing, right? Is owning the identifier, but then it's or controlling. Some people, really insist on the word control, and then it's how do you prove control, and that kind of leads to the second thing, right? An identifier is just a string, right? It's like the most simple kind being a public and private key. The public key is your identifier if you're using that as an identifier, and the private key is the way you prove ownership or control over the identifier. So that could look like resolving the public key to get a reference, this did document, this sort of like little formatted doc that says, here's the public key reference. And then challenging someone to say, hey, you know what? If you really own this identifier, if you really control it, you'll be able to sign a message with the private key, right? And sort of saying, are you the person who truly is in control of this? And that's really the system of decentralized identifiers is some public good, right? Be it a public key or otherwise. And there's lots of systems that use different things. And then some means of material, secret material, typically private keys associated with that identifier that only the true owner or controller will hold. And that's the system in a nutshell. Now there's format stuff we could get into, obviously, with like what does a did look like, what is this little document that has the public keys listed in it, but that's what it really comes down to.
So one thing that struck me is that there's a lot of did methods. So the way that the system was designed is to leave it very open for developers and organizations to define whatever did methods they wanted. And that created a situation where there was a lot of did methods. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what's the history of did methods, and how do they stack up against each other?
Yeah, so as you know, and you could probably look there. W3C has a little list of a little list. It's a massive list of almost like 200 did methods, and they range and they have all sorts of different constructions. Ways they're put together, attributes. There's a few big classes that like groups of did methods that kind of share similar attributes. There's very simplistic did methods like did key, where it is literally just a public key, right? And that's pretty straightforward. It's very uh, self-sovereign and decentralized in the sense that if you just have a single public key and private key pair and keep it under your control, obviously you could go on forever being known as that public key. It's just turns out it's really difficult to use a single public and private key pair over your whole life, right? Never having to roll it. Always having picked, like, I guess, the best curve that maybe isn't subject to quantum attacks like over time from the start, right? There's just lots of reasons why a single public and private key is tough, but there's a lot of methods, a few methods that are like that. Then there's other methods that are more centralized did methods. Even like there's did web, where it's effectively a address to a domain, and that's where references to the public key that supposedly control the address live. Now that is only as decentralized as DNS, and there's kind of a few did methods that rely on DNS, and so your security there is really like, well, who really owns the domain, right? Who's really in control of the domain, because they could override anything on it, right? And that's your layer of security and sort of your decentralization. There's tons of methods that are based on tokens, blockchain tokens, where they come up with their own little did method identifier, and maybe it's a public key, maybe it's some GUID, and then they have a current set of keys or material that's like on a public blockchain or private blockchain, and that's how you resolve. You basically go into that blockchain system, you get the public keys, and that's the mechanism. And maybe you need to pay in their tokens, or maybe you're using like an underlying blockchain's tokens like Ethereum or something like that, but effectively resolve around blockchains. Tons of those. And then there's some interesting ones that are not based on blockchains, but that do have a degree of decentralization. One I'd bring up is one that we kind of built out at Block, called did DHT, which that particular method was based on a DHT, a distributed hash table, the one that actually is the one for BitTorrent, right? Where you could put, it's a public key is your identifier, and you could have your did doc with other keys in it that's actually located on BitTorrent, the network, and propagated there. And that doesn't require a blockchain, but it comes with some limitations, right? Like you're kind of bound to this single key, and there's a no historical aspect to it. Like a blockchain has the history of key rolling. You kind of don't have that really with the distributed hash table. So it's a trade-off. And they just span the gambit. And you have to look at that as a user or a company getting into DIDs to say, well, which ones are the most adopted? Which ones tick off all the boxes, the features effectively that I would want? Because some don't support all of the DID features. And that's it. But there's a ton, and there's not a whole lot of industry movement around one particular, other than maybe the public key stuff in the most basic of credential use cases.
You anticipated my next question, which is going to be which did method is the most popular, and what is the use case that's driving that did method?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is it today. What we have gravitated towards as a community, maybe not everyone intentionally or being the desire, is that the majority of it has gone towards public keys, single key pair that is your identifier for using credentials that are predominantly linked to government activities, and that makes up the load and share of the actual deployed usage, I believe, of DIDs and credentials today, be it driver's licenses or EIDAS or any of these groups that are either directly governments or governmentally backed. It's proving things about your governmental identity. And I guess I would say about that, that's fine. That's a valid use case. Anyone can use the standards, and certainly it makes sense that governments would, right? Just like we have email, we're probably not going to always be showing paper driver's licenses, and that'd be crazy. I always tell people, like, think about identity. Like I'm in Star Trek in the year 2300 something, and like, is everything digitized? The food is literally being materialized out of nowhere, but like we somehow walk up and we're giving people a piece of paper to prove we should be like on the ship. It'd be absurd. So obviously, I think people have their own identity in that sense, and so governments are rational to do this. I would caution though that it's a little sad for me that that is sort of the predominant, overwhelming 90+% usage of them, because I would love to see it, in more interesting, things that consumers can do without a government, whether it's identity for apps or it's business to business identity. Maybe supply chain stuff is still a holdout use case. I think would be amazing, to be able to trace the supply chain and use credentials for that. There doesn't really have to be government involved. It could be consortiums of companies. But yeah, that's kind of where the world's at.
Um, so the use case for governments, is that tied to the wallet ecosystem? So are they using DIDs in the new European wallet initiatives?
So I think that's still a hotly debated thing. I forget if they had closed that out, but I thought we secured, at least last I could recall, I thought we secured language that did not exclude the use of DIDs, but that they would be, that they're uncertain or leaning towards not using them themselves and going with a sort of a bit more centralized or a bit more curated identifier that's more specific to whatever they're doing. I think I think it's a miss maybe to not use DIDs. I mean, people, I'm not going to bring up any specific individuals, but there were threads, debate threads on GitHub
Mhm.
where it was very clear to me that the governmentally associated folks in those threads did not see people owning their own identity, as independently of governments, as being even a thing that exists. And it's wild to me because I think there's maybe a little bit of myopia, with maybe they're working inside that machine, so it's like it's hard to see their use cases. But I tried to point out that actually the vast majority of your life does not rely on governmental identification, right? Like, when's the last time you're on Twitter and you're like, you know what, to follow you, man, I need to see your driver's license? I mean, it just isn't a thing. Most people in their interactions between friends or associates or businesses, they're not going around showing a governmental ID or some sort of governmental proof. They're forming their relationships through natural, organic means. I follow someone because I thought I saw a couple good tweets. Over time, I formulate my thoughts about them and how much I trust them and for which topics. And that is an organic formulation of identity that is the predominant case. And yes, governments obviously, through imposition or elective nature, fill a part of our lives today with identity, but the vast majority is not that. And I think that owning that identity and digitizing that apart from government credentials is still incredibly important.
Okay. Well, the topic today was achieving standard DID methods. What are some of the biggest challenges in doing that? What is the challenges to achieve standard DID methods?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'll start with the sad note, right? That I think we had the ability to do it maybe a little better with hindsight, as almost every initiative always has, right? But the problem I think with the industry is that since inception, nearly a decade ago, there everyone has been like, yeah, I want this to be a standard, and then let me go and make my own incredibly specific and individualistic implementation of it, usually specific to my own startup of 10 people, right? And we're all just going to use the standard, and that's been the problem. Is not the fact that the standard allows for there to be methods, because we want it to allow for that. We want it to be a format that could be used for another DID method down the line, because I don't think we're always going to nail it once and for like eons, millennia, we're all using the same exact DID method, right? It's going to have to evolve. The problem is that people didn't want to play ball with each other. I mean, it really comes down to such a human flaw, right? Is that people, whether it was the token people who saw it as a vehicle of more like fundraising, or it was folks who wanted to create a company around it, a traditional company around it that might not be blockchain based, but they're like coming up with their own DID methods. So they have a reason why they're going to sell that. No one really wanted to come together and say, let's not hinge. I don't want to try and convince the world to use my company's thing, right? My company's method. I want to use whatever has the best chance at being adopted by the most people. And I think it's a selfless thing. It takes humility to do it. And I just don't think that really hardly anyone in the space was there from a mindset perspective. And it's for better or for worse, right? They got companies, they got, mouths to feed, I get it. I understand it from that perspective, but going forward, if we have any prayer at this, I think people need to come together and say, I'm going to set every ounce of, my pride, my ego, my moneyed interest aside. And what can we use that serves our needs, that maybe it takes some trade-offs, and maybe it's not exactly how I do it if I was in sole control of determining this. But some of those factors would include not attaching it to a token that has moneyed interest, with like a small group, right? Not doing one that's heavily centralized, not doing one that's owned by the IP of a company. Hopefully doing something based on a public system like Bitcoin or DHT, something that's already deployed. Because that's another factor of hindrance to a standard method, is the startup cost from zero. I mean, I don't even understand how some of these startups thought they were going to do it, is almost insurmountable. To say like, oh, I'm 5 people, the world is going to use my DID method. They have to go convince browser vendors, massive identity companies and cloud vendors. It's just not going to happen if you're not bringing them in the tent. As much as I want to believe in like the David and Goliath story is going to happen, and it has happened sometimes in history, it's very unlikely in this case. And I think we all need to put on our big boy pants and like realize that's what we're working with, is the real world. And so that would be my guidance at how we get to that, is factoring all that in and being very sober about what we've done, why it hasn't worked, and what we need to do in the future.
Something that I heard in the past was that there was pushback from the browser vendors on DIDs because there were so many DID methods and they didn't know which ones to support. Is that true? And has that changed at all, if it is true?
Yeah, I mean, if my hot take on that topic is that I think it depends on the vendor. I think the vendors all had various interest. The interesting thing about Microsoft is I think they almost might have been the least had the most neutral feedback, that they wanted something, and there wasn't really anything too much behind any objections or nits. There were other vendors, and I have to say Apple, that really understand. I think they're not naive, that in the back of their head, given what they've done with the App Store and hobbling PWAs and all these very strategic things, that giving up that identity, which they have a stranglehold over, that is part of a keystone to their own walled garden, is something that they probably don't want to do. And there's lots of reasons that were floated. Oh, we can't pick even a method because the standard allows for blockchain-based methods. And don't you know, and this is like back in 2017, don't you know there's this article that says Bitcoin will literally boil the ocean by 2025, right? It's the ocean will literally be boiling. Like it's going to consume 50% of the world's energy. And, it's just, of course, we know these things are ludicrous. They have not come to pass. It's incredible fear mongering, but it's a great way to squelch a fledgling standard by pointing to this big boogeyman literally in the sky, and kind of being able to sort of have this thought terminating cliche. And I think that that's exactly what happened to the most extent with most of these vendors. And it was effective. It was very effective. They seized a narrative at the time, and it was able to sort of run this down. And I think the community needs to come together And if it has a chance at this, it's got to look at that feedback. And even though you may not agree with some of it, find did methods that work around those things. Even though some people in the community know, based on calculator math, that they're, doesn't make sense what they're saying, their objections. There are methods we can do to work around it. DDHT was one of those. It was, and I'll give you a profile of why I think so. DidDHT was based on an existing system that all the vendors already used. All the vendors in clouds use BitTorrent to some extent. Lots of them distribute software over BitTorrent and actually interact with that network. So it's already in their tent. It's an existing widely deployed network. From any given point, there's 15 to 20 million computers that are exchanging parts and interacting with parts of the hash table. So that's a feather in your cap. You don't have to start from zero, right? It doesn't use a blockchain, so it doesn't have that that nit of we're going to boil the oceans, right? It's not controversial. It's not based on a moneyed token, right? So I think that's just one example, but we have to find something like that checks all those boxes for specifically browser vendors, because no matter what, they're going to be around for at least a while, right? I don't think they're going away in the next 10 years. I would probably put 20 years on that bet. So that's who we're dealing with. That's the primary gatekeepers to adoption, and we got to check the boxes that they need checked.
Yeah, and just for the audience, DHT is distributed hash tables?
Hash table. That's correct, yeah. Mm-hmm. And the distributed hash table that runs BitTorrent is called mainline, and you can write into it. It's a decentralized system. So.
And so normally when we think about achieving standards, we think about standards body. Do you think that an organization like the W3C or the DIF, the Decentralized Identity Foundation, could have a role to play in this goal of achieving standard DID methods?
Yeah, I hope so. I think DIF is a great place to do it. I think W3C is almost a necessary place to do it, whether you want to have your main spec there or an IETF or whatever. But those three organizations are probably key. And say one thing that actually mirrors the tragedy of the DID method commons, allowing you to litter your DID method literally everywhere, is similar in the SDO space, the standard development organization space, where right off the bat, it was, we need a standard around this and we need a standard DID method. So naturally what we're going to do is create 200 DID methods and about 25 standards bodies that all are competing with each other. And even when, like with DIF, I'll give you an example, we kind of formed it to be like the one identity-centric, decentralized identity-centric one. I think people would have done it in a couple of the other standards bodies instead, except for those bodies initially were very averse to working on this body of work. So people logically thought, okay, we need at least one place to organize. And right off the bat, like it was like a few people joined, but then people were like, no, I want my own body that I kind of control. And here's my other one. Like, it's just like, it mirrored almost exactly the amount of DID methods we had at a certain scale. So people need to put aside their ego, their money and interest, and their pride. And at all levels of the stack, as it were, because if we don't, failure is the destination, because you're fighting yourselves, right? You should be fighting, not in a negative way, the bigger gatekeepers by having really well-formed specs and having a tight community. But instead, everyone is it's like the ants fighting each other while the wasps are just swooping in.
So even assuming we could have standard DID methods, what do you think would be some of the key technical hurdles to achieving that?
Yeah, so I mean, there's probably there's a spectrum. So in terms of DID capabilities, you should think about DIDs as having all these features that you could implement. Not everything's a must implement in the DID spec. Things like a really good example is service endpoints aren't a must implement. Now, I would argue that your DIDs, if they don't support service endpoints, are pretty useless for 95% of identity activities a human goes through, which is like posting data to apps, storing data. You have to have an endpoint, right? You can't just give me a public key and say, find my tweets. It's like, I don't know, man. I don't know how to find them. You got to give me some pointers. Public keys have the fewest features, right? The public key methods, where it's just a public key and a private key. Then you kind of have this middle ground with things like DidDHT, which have most of the features, but not like key rolling for the control key. Like there's the single control key for the did doc. You can't really roll that key effectively. There's no safe way to do it. But you have most of the did doc features. So that's a key hurdle. If you want everything, if you really truly wanted every feature and have the most robust, secure, and I'd say A plus did method, you would probably need something like a side chain or a one-way space chain on Bitcoin. And I say Bitcoin because it's the most used blockchain. You can create these things called side chains that are not monetarily based side chains. They don't have their own token. And they can even be one way where you like put some Bitcoin in almost to use as a fuel. And those get turned into non-monetary tokens that have literally no ability to speculate on them in the sidechain. And the sidechain would just take care of things like memorizing key roles and compressing the history state for identifiers and doing a really good job of not bloating the main Bitcoin blockchain, because that's eventually going to be very expensive to write to. So something like a one-way space chain, in my view, off of Bitcoin represents an A plus. We would need covenants proposals in Bitcoin, which are being debated now, to land to be able to support the really nice constructions of a one-way space chain that we need to do that. So it's not really technically feasible yet, but that's probably 18 months to 24 months out, and that's kind of the spectrum. We can act on things like the middle ground today, though. And I had talked to a couple browser vendors, and they said, "Oh, BitTorrent. Okay, like I think we could add that. We could even add some helper methods to browsers to support looking up DHT stuff in a decentralized way." And that was something they were open to. So I would encourage the community to go really dialogue with vendors at length in where they meet, right? On their bug trackers, in their GitHubs. Find them. Don't make them come to you, and start making these active proposals, because I think it's possible to do. It's just that there's no concerted effort yet.
I had Sam Goto from the Chrome team on the live stream a couple of months back. He's a great technologist, and he told me that they have a 10-year roadmap for Chrome. So if they think about a feature, it's going to be some time before you actually see it in Chrome.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I don't have a question there. It's just more of an observation. My follow-up question was the topic, the title, going back to the title again, it's achieving standard did methods, plural.
Mm.
Um, how many did methods do you think that is? Is it 2 or is it 4 or do we ultimately want 1?
I think it'll always be more than one, and it should be, because I think there's reasons for that. I think there's like the universal did methods that are always offline usable, and maybe public key, something like that always has to exist. I think there's probably good reason to argue that something based on DNS will and should exist, because it's a deployed system that is the easiest for everyone to deploy code for. So that could, even though I would want a more decentralized option, I would agree, like public key, something based on DNS, and then your more decentralized option. And I think there should be one of those. I think that, like I said, space chain on Bitcoin. The reason I say Bitcoin and one is because you can see from the communities, like Bitcoin has the greatest ability and probably probability of lasting for a long time. So that's really why you're picking it. If something else had those attributes, I'd pick that. But it's
Yeah.
it's about longevity, because we're talking about identity. This is decades that people will have these identifiers. We can't be playing fast and loose with some random shitcoin some guy like minted on a website yesterday and is trying to sell you on the future of identity. So I think it probably looks like 3, and 3 in those buckets. And I know that's a too much specificity. Maybe it's 4, maybe it's 2, but it's not 1. And it has to fulfill these feature attributes to give everyone an ability to pick something that they can live with.
Oh, I had a good follow-up question, then shitcoin got me sidetracked. Oh my God. Let me ask you a question. This one's sort of been bugging me for a while. I had a LinkedIn thread with somebody on decentralized identity, and he gave me this whole long explanation, and I said, I loved it up until the point where you said blockchain. You mentioned Bitcoin, and I sort of buy into that. I just buy into like the fact how long Bitcoin's been around, how much it's worth as a total market cap, and so I believe Bitcoin is sort of special. Um, but do you think that you maybe you already answered this question, but do you think that a decentralized identity solution, that there's going to be at least one that's tied to a blockchain, and that so the person on LinkedIn said to me, blockchain has all these special properties that no other system have, and I whenever I dig into that, I start to doubt it. But
Mhm.
what are your thoughts on, I guess, on whether so many people tie decentralized identity and blockchain, and is that a mistake?
So I think there's a reason. There's one. Someone could have told you a bunch of things that blockchain, these attributes that are sort of tenuous, or you could debate them. But I think blockchains do actually solve one really really important thing, and I think it's the chronological oracle problem. There is no objective way presently prior to Bitcoin to say, you know what, there's this event that I've time stamped that objectively everyone in the universe can look at and run code independently to say this event happened at time X, and then later in logical time, this event happened at time Y, right? That simple statement was not possible in a trustless, decentralized way to ascertain prior to Bitcoin. You just couldn't do it. You'd always have to say, "Oh, I trust this company. They said so. I've replicated this, and all these, maybe multiple people said so." It was always said so. That's what it really comes down to. So the principal reason why people gravitate towards a blockchain, and I think it would only be Bitcoin, because I wouldn't trust my identity being anchored in a system that wasn't going to be around for decades or my entire life, is that key rolling specifically. When I roll a key, especially if I want to change off key types, I have to be able to say I've started my identifier at point X, right, or time X, and I have this set of keys, and I want to roll to a new either base key or signing key, whatever it may be. So the ability to say these operations happened in this time and everyone can observe it and compute that is something special that only blockchains do. And that's actually why Satoshi, what he really created was a chronological oracle. That's actually the invention. The fact that it's used for money is actually a higher level utilization of the fact that you can encode events happening in a chronological, uh, a series of time. It just so happens you can do money on that because the transfers need to be replayable. So that's what I would say, and that's the logical reason people bring it up. You don't need to be doing a bunch of stuff on Bitcoin. Like you see some of these crazy methods where they're like encoding massive, JPEGs on Bitcoin and they're trading JPEGs. It's similar. I would never do all that on Bitcoin, like my key rolls. But if you had a sidechain that was hyper optimized, you don't need to write back to Bitcoin very often. And that's the way I would go. And that's why people do it, is there is actually novelty there that never existed before. And you can challenge people, by the way. You can say, well, how would I do it? I don't trust, it's Alice, Bob, and Carol. I don't trust any of you to tell me what Carol's, I come across her identifier, what her current key set is, right? Her current did doc. What should the resolution look like? I don't trust any of you. I want a way with math that I could get objective data, I could compute it, and I could come up with Carol's correct state. There's no other system on the planet that can do it. And they'll twist themselves in pretzels, like Olympic level mental gymnastics, trying to come up with all these ridiculous, excuses or systems that try to do it, but it's just not possible.
So good insight. I remembered the question I forgot, and then we'll go to last thoughts. Tim Berners-Lee said, "My internet or my web is already decentralized." And when I heard you talk about some system that was already widely deployed and already decentralized, in a way, I think, isn't that DNS? Because each domain controls its own, namespace and rules. So any thoughts on, I didn't hear you mention did web as one of those three. What are your thoughts on
Yeah,
did web?
I did. I think when I said the three, it was public private key, a DNS based method, And then
Oh, so you were saying DNS and web sort of as one.
yeah, I think they're synonymous because really the root of trust goes down to DNS. It's not
Fair enough.
in terms of trust. So it's who owns the domain, right? Now, if you unpack that, it's like if I just got a Facebook, like if the did web was Facebook/Alice, and she had
Hmm.
public keys listed there, obviously, intuitively, we know that just like Facebook, a traditional Facebook ID, Facebook could stop serving that file, could change the key, could do anything they want with that response coming from the server. So it's that's not decentralized at all. That's heavily centralized.
Right.
Now, you could back that up and say, well, you could just get your own domain name, right? And
That
that's
was my
true.
next
You go
question.
purchase your own domain, alice.com, she's got her own domain, she controls it, but not really. DNS serves at the behest of about 5 governments, and that's the reality. And even the ones that are what some people in some parts of the world would regard as nice are not so nice. We see their logos from their 3-letter agencies appear on web pages, proudly announcing the fact that they control the internet. And we've seen people be disappeared from social media at the behest of the U.S. government, I should note, during a few years ago, right? They literally embedded 3-letter organizations to direct people to be, suspended or removed from platforms. They could do that with DNS. We haven't seen that level of targeting, but I don't know, man. You look down the road 10 years, 20 years. I don't know what the world looks like, but I'm not comfortable with that amount of power. I would hope we have something that is not so susceptible to some person getting in power that we don't like, even in a good government like the United States, who are like, oh man, I really don't like that guy. I wonder what he's going to do to our identity infrastructure. I don't want that to
True.
be my failure point. I want better. So.
Okay, so let's go to last thoughts. We're a little over, and I apologize for that. But any last thoughts?
Yeah, so I work at Gemini right now. You could definitely check them out if you want to buy some Bitcoin. That's my one shameless plug, I guess, is more for Bitcoin, but go to Gemini. I think that join some of these SDOs. Diff is a key one. I think they've been the most neutral, the most collaborative. They really, really believe in doing this. There's an initiative in W3C to actually standardize some DID methods that is sort of right there, and let's see if we can get this thing to materialize. But dig in. You're going to have to dig in and really advocate to the browser vendors. That is the path we need to go, I think, at this juncture. And if we can do that, maybe we could be successful. I don't really have anything else to show personally. I'm not directly working on all the identity stuff day to day at this point, but it could be in the future. I'm going to kind of act as a person who's keenly interested in some of the open source work, maybe contribute to it and see what you all do with that information. Try hard. I'd be there to help anyone who wants to, but let's get it done. It's going to take years of work more.
Awesome. Well, okay. I always got a lot of insights talking to you at IAW, and I thought this was a great session. So thank you so much, Daniel. I wish you the best of luck. I hope we do see you in the industry again. But just thank you again for sharing with the audience.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Okay, and we'll see you next time, audience. And don't forget to follow on LinkedIn. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. Just hit follow on the LinkedIn Identity Office Hours page. And we'll see you next time. See ya.